A new black police chief, a hostile officer, and a missing child. What starts with prejudice transforms into a powerful story of courage, redemption, and unexpected unity. The precinct hummed with activity as officers shuffled between desks, phones rang incessantly, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. It was a typical Monday morning at the downtown police station, until Charles Monroe walked in. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. By the way, what city are you watching us from? Write it in the comments, we're curious. Standing tall in his pristine uniform, Charles carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. He had served in law enforcement for over 2 decades, working his way up through diligence and unwavering integrity. Today, however, was different. This was his first day as chief of police, and he knew the challenges awaiting him extended far beyond managing crime statistics. The chatter in the room began to die down as Charles's presence registered among the staff. Whispers darted between officers. Some expressed curiosity, others concealed skepticism. At the far side of the room, Officer Raymond Hale leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he watched Charles make his way to the front desk. Raymond was a veteran officer, known for his brash demeanor and quick temper. The sight of a black man in a high-ranking position unsettled him. To Raymond, Charles didn't belong here, not in his precinct, not in his world. Fueled by years of unchallenged prejudice, Raymond's disdain grew with each step Charles took. Finally, unable to contain himself, Raymond strode toward Charles, his boots echoing sharply against the tiled floor. His voice, loud and abrasive, cut through the air like a knife. "Who are you, and what do you think you're doing here?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the confrontation. Officers froze in mid-task, some feigning distraction while others openly gawked. Charles didn't flinch. He met Raymond's glare with calm resolve, his expression unwavering. He didn't rush to explain himself, nor did he react to the hostility radiating from Raymond. The tension thickened as seconds stretched into an unbearable pause. For Raymond, the lack of response was infuriating. He stepped closer, his voice rising, demanding an answer. Still, Charles held his ground, his silence unshakable. The quiet confidence in his demeanor only fueled Raymond's anger. In a flash, Raymond's hand shot out. He grabbed Charles by the collar and shoved him against the wall, the metallic clatter of a desk lamp tumbling to the floor breaking the silence. Gasps rippled through the room as officers stared, paralyzed by the sudden escalation. Charles remained composed, his deep brown eyes locking onto Raymond's. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but laced with unmistakable authority. "This won't go unaddressed. I'm your new chief of police." The weight of his words crashed over the room like a thunderclap. Raymond's grip loosened as his face drained of color. He staggered back, his mouth opening as if to apologize, but no words came. Charles adjusted his uniform with deliberate precision, the room still hanging on his every move. He glanced around, meeting the eyes of every officer in the room. Without raising his voice, he commanded the attention of all present. "Follow me," he said, nodding toward Raymond. His tone carried no malice, only purpose. Raymond hesitated for a moment before following Charles into his office, the tension in the room finally breaking as whispers and murmurs filled the void. As the office door clicked shut behind them, the precinct remained charged with the weight of what had just unfolded. For many, it was the first time they had witnessed the confrontation of an unspoken prejudice that had long lurked in their ranks. But for Charles, it was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Inside the chief's office, the atmosphere was stifling. The heavy wooden desk, neatly arranged with files and a polished nameplate reading "Chief Charles Monroe," seemed to loom large in the small space. The blinds were partially drawn, casting thin stripes of light across the room. Charles motioned for Raymond to sit, but the officer hesitated, his usual swagger replaced by unease. Instead, Raymond chose to stand, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his arms crossed defensively. Charles remained composed as he took his seat behind the desk, his calm gaze fixed on Raymond. The momentary silence was purposeful, it forced Raymond to confront the weight of his actions. When Charles finally spoke, his tone was firm but measured. He dissected Raymond's behavior in the precinct, pointing out the inappropriate aggression and lack of professionalism. Charles wasn't loud, but his words carried undeniable authority, each one slicing through the tension like a scalpel. Raymond stood there, his jaw tightening as he listened. The officer's initial defensiveness began to wane under Charles's steady, logical dismantling of his actions. Charles wasn't simply reprimanding him, he was holding up a mirror to Raymond's conduct, forcing him to confront the prejudice that had driven his behavior. But even as Raymond's posture softened, the weight of his ingrained biases lingered. He had never been called out so directly, especially by someone like Charles, someone he had wrongfully judged before they had exchanged even a single word. Charles leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, his voice softening just slightly. He wasn't there to humiliate Raymond, he was there to ensure the officer understood the gravity of his actions and how they impacted not only their team but the community they served. Before the conversation could reach its natural conclusion, a sharp knock sounded at the door. The interruption broke the charged atmosphere, and an officer entered, her face tense with urgency. "Chief, we've just received a report of a missing child," she said, handing over a preliminary report. Charles's focus shifted immediately. He scanned the document, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the details. Michael Carter, a 7-year-old boy, had been reported missing near his family's neighborhood just an hour ago. The urgency was unmistakable, every second mattered in cases like this. Charles rose from his chair with purpose, his earlier discussion with Raymond temporarily set aside. "We're responding to this immediately," he said, his tone leaving no room for delay. Raymond, unsure of where he stood with his new chief, hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. He knew this was his chance to redeem himself, not through words, but through action. Together, they left the office and headed to the squad cars. The precinct, now abuzz with activity, mirrored the tension between the two men. For Charles and Raymond, this would be more than just a rescue mission. It was an opportunity to bridge a chasm of misunderstanding, though neither of them knew it yet. As they sped toward the Carter family's home, the gravity of the situation loomed large. A child's life was at stake, and their ability to work together would soon be tested in ways neither of them had anticipated. The Carter family's neighborhood was a picturesque enclave of suburban comfort. Lush green lawns bordered pristine sidewalks, and the houses, with their manicured gardens and freshly painted facades, reflected success and stability. It was a community where everything seemed perfect, until now. Charles and Raymond pulled up to a 2-story brick home with large windows and a wraparound porch. The driveway held 2 luxury cars, gleaming even in the overcast afternoon light. For Raymond, the sight of the house was an unexpected jolt. His mind struggled to reconcile the family's wealth and elegance with his preconceived notions about black families. Charles, ever focused, stepped out of the car without hesitation. Raymond followed, his gaze lingering on the house as they approached the door. The Carters greeted them with anxious expressions. Michael's mother, Grace, was composed but visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of her son. Michael's father, Robert, stood tall but silent, his jaw tight with worry. Inside, the home was immaculate, every detail carefully curated, a testament to the family's hard work and success. Raymond couldn't help but notice the framed diplomas on the wall, the shelves filled with books, and the photographs capturing happy family moments. Grace quickly explained the situation. Michael had been playing outside, riding his bike near the end of their quiet street. When she called him for lunch, there was no answer. At first, she thought he might have wandered into a neighbor's yard, but when her calls went unanswered, panic set in. Robert added that Michael was an adventurous boy with a fascination for exploring the unknown. "Storm drains," he said, his voice heavy with worry. "He's always been curious about them. I've told him to stay away, but, his voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken fear hanging in the air. Charles absorbed the details with a practiced calm. He assured the Carters they would do everything in their power to find Michael. As the officers stepped back outside, Raymond's unease shifted from the family to the task at hand. Charles led the way, walking down the street with Raymond beside him. They examined the area where Michael had last been seen. The quiet neighborhood felt eerie now, the absence of children playing or neighbors chatting amplifying the tension. At the corner of the street, Charles stopped. A manhole cover lay slightly ajar, its heavy iron lid pushed to the side. He knelt to inspect it, his sharp eyes scanning for clues. A faint scuff mark on the rim caught his attention. It looked fresh, as if something or someone had disturbed it recently. The faint sound of crying drifted up from the manhole. Both men froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable, a child's sobs, faint but persistent. Charles immediately called for backup and equipment, but he knew time was critical. Peering into the dark void below, he could make out the faint outline of a small figure clinging to a pipe. It was Michael. The boy's cries were growing louder, but his body language screamed fear and confusion. Charles and Raymond exchanged a glance. This was no simple rescue. The boy was terrified and trapped in a precarious position. One wrong move could cause him to lose his grip or panic further. "We'll get him out," Charles said, his tone resolute. But the challenge was clear. Michael needed not just physical rescue, but emotional reassurance, and they couldn't afford to fail. As they prepared for the delicate task ahead, the weight of the moment pressed on both men. For Charles, this was a chance to lead through action, to prove his authority in competence. For Raymond, it was an opportunity to set aside his biases and focus on what truly mattered, saving a life. The search was far from over. The rescue had begun. The faint cries of the boy echoed up from the dark, damp confines of the storm drain, sending a chill through both officers. Charles quickly assessed the situation, his years of experience guiding his thoughts. Time was critical. Michael's fear and fatigue could lead to a disastrous fall if they didn't act fast. Backup was still en route, but neither man was willing to wait. Charles took a flashlight from his utility belt and shone it into the drain, illuminating the frightened face of 7-year-old Michael. The boy's tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands gripped a rusty pipe, the only thing keeping him from falling deeper into the labyrinth of the stormwater system. Charles called out to Michael, his voice steady and calm, aiming to soothe the boy's escalating panic. But Michael shook his head violently, his sobs intensifying. It was clear that words alone wouldn't reach him. Raymond watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and determination. For the first time, his focus wasn't on himself, his pride, or his prejudices, it was on the terrified child clinging to life below. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "I'm going in," Raymond said, his voice low but resolute. Charles gave him a sharp look, measuring the sincerity in his tone. After a brief pause, he nodded. "Be careful," was all he said. Raymond pulled off his jacket and lowered himself into the manhole, his boots scraping against the metal rungs of the ladder. The further down he descended, the colder and darker it became. The narrow space reeked of damp earth and stagnant water, but Raymond forced himself to focus solely on Michael. When he reached the bottom, the boy was just a few feet away, clinging to the pipe like a lifeline. The murky water around them rippled with every tiny movement. Raymond crouched, carefully positioning himself to avoid startling Michael. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his tone far gentler than anyone at the precinct would have expected from him. "I'm here to help. I won't let anything happen to you, okay?" Michael's wide eyes locked onto Raymond's. For a moment, the officer saw nothing but pure fear in the boy's gaze. But slowly, the calming tone of Raymond's voice began to work. Michael's grip on the pipe loosened ever so slightly, though he still refused to let go. Above ground, Charles kept a close watch, shouting updates to the team that had just arrived with additional gear. He coordinated their efforts with precision, ensuring the rescue rope and harness were ready for Michael. Back below, Raymond carefully edged closer to the boy. The pipe creaked under Michael's weight, and the sound sent a fresh wave of panic through him. He screamed, tears streaming down his face. Raymond froze, his heart pounding. "You're doing great," Raymond said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm going to get us out of here. But I need you to trust me, okay? Can you hold on to me instead of the pipe?" Michael shook his head, his small body trembling. Raymond realized that words wouldn't be enough. With painstaking care, he reached out and wrapped one strong arm around the boy, pulling him close. Michael resisted at first, his fear overwhelming him, but Raymond's firm grip and soothing reassurances finally broke through. The boy clung to Raymond's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. With the child secure in his arms, Raymond signaled to Charles above. The harness and rope were lowered into the manhole, and Raymond carefully adjusted it around Michael. He checked the fit twice, ensuring it was snug and safe. "Okay, Michael," he said, his voice steady. "They're going to pull you up now. I'll be right behind you." The boy nodded, his trust in Raymond evident despite his fear. Slowly, the team above hoisted Michael out of the manhole. When his small form emerged into the daylight, cheers and sighs of relief rippled through the gathered officers and neighbors. Raymond climbed out moments later, covered in grime but wearing a look of quiet triumph. As he emerged, he was met with an approving nod from Charles, a silent acknowledgement of his bravery and compassion. Michael's parents rushed forward, sweeping their son into their arms as tears streamed down their faces. Grace and Robert turned to the officers, their gratitude evident. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice breaking. "You saved our son." Charles and Raymond exchanged a glance. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. The events of the day had begun to chip away at the barriers between them, revealing the shared humanity beneath their differences. The rescue was over, but its impact was just beginning to take hold. That evening, the Carter family insisted the officers join them for dinner. Despite their initial hesitations, Charles and Raymond accepted the invitation. After the day's events, it felt like the right way to close such an intense chapter. Inside the Carter home, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold tension that had hung over the precinct earlier. The dining room was bathed in soft light, the table set with care. The aroma of Grace's cooking filled the air, creating a sense of comfort and belonging. As they sat down to eat, Michael, freshly bathed and dressed in his pajamas, clung to his mother's side. His wide eyes, now filled with admiration, darted between Charles and Raymond. It was clear the day's events had left an indelible impression on the boy. Conversation flowed more easily than anyone expected. Robert shared stories about his career in finance, while Grace talked about her work as a community organizer. Their lives, full of hard work and dedication, resonated deeply with Charles, who listened intently. For Raymond, the evening was a revelation. Everything about the Carters challenged the stereotypes he had long held. This was a family that defied every narrow assumption he had made earlier that day. Michael's laughter broke through the conversation as he recounted how the brave policeman had climbed into the storm drain to save him. He looked at Raymond with unfiltered admiration, his innocent praise leaving the officer uncharacteristically quiet. For Charles, the meal was more than just food and conversation, it was an opportunity to bridge divides. He watched as Raymond gradually let his guard down, engaging with the Carters not out of obligation but out of genuine interest. After dessert, Grace handed Charles and Raymond steaming cups of coffee and gestured toward the living room. The group migrated there, sinking into plush sofas as the conversation shifted to broader topics. The Carters shared their perspectives on the struggles they faced as a black family, their voices steady but tinged with pain. Raymond listened, his usual defensiveness absent. For perhaps the first time, he allowed himself to truly hear their experiences without dismissing or questioning them. The walls of prejudice he had carried for years were crumbling, brick by brick. As the evening wound down, the officers prepared to leave. At the door, Grace placed a hand on Raymond's arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You didn't just save our son today, you showed us what courage and kindness look like." Raymond, unaccustomed to such heartfelt gratitude, simply nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. On the drive back to the precinct, the silence between Charles and Raymond was different now. It wasn't the cold, tense silence of earlier that day. It was reflective, almost companionable. Finally, Raymond broke the quiet. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice low but firm. "About a lot of things." Charles glanced at him, a small but genuine smile forming. "It's not about being right or wrong. It's about what you do moving forward." The days that followed saw a remarkable shift in their dynamic. At the precinct, Raymond began to seek out Charles's guidance, not out of obligation but out of respect. Their partnership grew stronger, built on trust and shared purpose. As word of the rescue spread, the community's perception of the precinct began to shift as well. Charles's leadership and Raymond's actions became symbols of change, proof that even deep divides could be bridged through understanding and compassion. Months later, Charles and Raymond stood side by side at a community event organized by the Carters to celebrate the precinct's efforts in fostering unity. Raymond, once a skeptic of everything Charles stood for, now spoke openly about the lessons he had learned. Looking out over the diverse crowd gathered in the park, Charles felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the beginning of something larger than himself, larger than the precinct. It was a testament to the power of change, both within individuals and within a community. For Raymond, the journey had been humbling but transformative. He no longer saw the world in black and white. Instead, he saw the richness of humanity in all its shades and complexities. As the event concluded, Charles and Raymond exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. Their story was no longer one of division, but of unity, growth, and the promise of a brighter future.